The wind was a thief, stealing the last of the day's warmth and leaving behind the biting chill of a Montana Christmas Eve. Eleanor Vance pulled her threadbare cloak tighter, her breath pluming in the frigid air of the small, dilapidated cabin. It was less a home and more a collection of logs huddled together against the vast, unforgiving wilderness, a final, desperate inheritance from a father she barely remembered. The structure groaned under the assault of the rising gale, a mournful sound that echoed the hollowness in her chest. Outside, the world was turning white, the snow falling not in gentle flakes, but in a furious, horizontal sheet that promised to bury everything. She had fled Philadelphia and the suffocating grip of Judge Alastair Sterling, the man her stepfather had betrothed her to before his own convenient demise. Sterling, with his cold eyes and proprietary hands, saw her not as a person, but as the final acquisition in her family's ruined estate. Her defiance had been a small, sputtering candle against his immense influence. But here, in this remote corner of the world, she had hoped that candle might be enough to light a new life. Now, it seemed it would only be enough to light her way to an icy grave. Her fingers, stiff with cold, fumbled with the last of her firewood. She placed the splintered log onto the meager embers in the stone hearth, praying it would catch. It was a foolish hope, much like her journey west. She possessed an iron will and an education that was useless against the raw power of a blizzard. Her supplies were dwindling, her hope even more so. The encroaching darkness outside was matched by the one gathering in her heart. She was alone, utterly and completely. The thought was a physical weight, pressing down on her until it was hard to breathe. Silas Blackwood guided his horse, Ajax, along the northern fence line, his head bowed against the wind's razor-sharp edge. The sky had turned the color of a fresh bruise, and the snow was coming down with a vengeance that spoke of a long, hard night. He should have been back at his cabin an hour ago, snug and secure, the storm a distant howl beyond his sturdy walls. But a premonition, a familiar unease that had kept him alive through worse things than a blizzard, had pushed him to check this last stretch of wire. Solitude was his creed, the quiet expanse of his ranch the only church he attended. He had come to this high valley to escape ghosts, the ghosts of Shiloh, of a brother lost, of a world that no longer made sense. He had built his life like a fortress, each log in his cabin, each post in his fence, a deliberate stone in the wall around his heart. People were complications, their needs and their noise a disruption to the hard-won peace he had carved out of the wilderness. He had everything he needed right here, his land, his horse, and the silence. And yet, as the storm howled like a wounded animal, a deep, instinctual loneliness, one he ruthlessly suppressed on most days, gnawed at the edges of his resolve. It was then he saw it, a flicker of light, impossibly faint where no light should be. The old Miller Line shack. He had thought it abandoned for years, a relic collapsing back into the earth. To see a lamp burning within its crumbling walls on a night like this was not just a surprise. It was a death sentence for whoever was inside. His first instinct, honed by years of self-preservation, was to turn Ajax toward home. It was not his business. Getting involved was a fool's errand, a crack in the fortress he had so carefully constructed. He pulled on the reins, and Ajax halted, the horse's warm breath misting in the frigid air. The light flickered again, a desperate, guttering pulse against the overwhelming dark. Silas cursed under his breath. His father, a man of few words but unbending principles, had taught him that you did not leave a man to face the elements alone. You did not pass by on the other side. The war had burned away much of his father's teachings, but that one, stubbornly, remained. It was a matter of honor, a concept he both clung to and resented. He could not leave them. He could not ride away and let that light be extinguished, knowing he might have prevented it. With a sigh that was lost to the wind, he nudged Ajax forward, his jaw tight with reluctance. He was breaking his own first rule, mind your own business. As he drew closer, the shack looked even more pathetic, its roof sagging, snow already piling in drifts against the leeward wall. He dismounted, the snow crunching under his boots, and tied Ajax to a skeletal-looking pine. He walked to the door, a flimsy plank construction that looked as if a strong gust could tear it from its leather hinges. He raised a gloved fist and knocked, the sound jarringly loud in the storm's vortex. Inside, the knock was like a gunshot. Eleanor froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Every horror story she had ever heard about the frontier, of outlaws and wild men, rushed through her mind. No one knew she was here. No one. She backed away from the hearth, her hand instinctively reaching for the heavy iron poker. It was a pitiful weapon, but it was all she had. The knock came again, harder this time, more insistent. A man's voice, deep and rough-edged, cut through the wind. "Hello, the cabin. Anyone in there?" Fear warred with a sliver of desperate hope. It was a human voice. Not a monster, not a phantom of the storm, but a man. She remained silent, clutching the poker, her knuckles white. "The storm's bad," the voice called out again, closer to the door now. "This shack won't last the night. You need to come with me." She crept closer to the door, peering through a small crack in the chinking. All she could see was a broad shoulder covered in a snow-dusted canvas coat and the dark shape of a hat. He was a stranger offering help. But her trust had been shattered too many times to be given freely, especially to a man who appeared out of a blizzard on Christmas Eve. Silas waited, the snow stinging his face. He was beginning to regret this. He could feel the presence inside, the fear rolling off the cabin in waves. He was about to turn away, to tell himself he had tried, when a new thought struck him. It was Christmas Eve, a day that had long ago lost its meaning for him. But he remembered what it was supposed to mean. Family, warmth, not being alone. The irony was bitter, but the conviction was solid. He took a breath and spoke again, his voice gentler this time, the words coming out unplanned. "Mom? Sir? It's Christmas Eve. No one should be alone tonight, especially not in a storm like this." Eleanor's grip on the poker loosened. The words, so simple and unexpected, disarmed her. They were not the words of a predator. They were words of kindness, a sentiment she had not encountered in a very long time. It was the mention of Christmas Eve that broke through her fear. The cruel joke of her situation, fleeing to this desolate place only to face her end on a night meant for joy, was suddenly too much to bear. Tears pricked at her eyes. Taking a shaky breath, she unlatched the door. It swung inward with a groan, revealing the man on her doorstep. He was tall and broad, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat, his shoulders laden with snow. He looked like he had been carved from the very mountains that surrounded them, hard, weathered, and immense. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, met hers, and in them she saw not malice, but a weary sort of concern. Silas looked at the woman before him. She was slighter than he had imagined, her face pale and smudged with soot. But her eyes, wide and frightened, held a spark of defiance. She held a fireplace poker like a sword. He respected that. He slowly removed his hat, shaking the snow from its brim. "My name is Silas Blackwood," he said, his voice low and steady. "My cabin is a mile east of here. It's solid. You'll be safe there." Eleanor looked from his face to the swirling white chaos behind him, then back to the dying embers in her hearth. He was right. This place was a tomb. To stay was to surrender. To go with him was a risk, but it was a risk that held the promise of survival. She gave a single, sharp nod. "I am Eleanor Vance," she replied, her voice firmer than she felt. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. I will accept your offer." The journey to his cabin was a battle against a living entity. The wind tore at them, a physical force that sought to rip Eleanor from the saddle of Silas's horse. She sat behind him, her hands clenched tightly around his waist, her face buried in the rough canvas of his coat. The smell of pine, leather, and cold air filled her senses. She could feel the solid strength of his back against her chest, a bulwark against the storm's fury. He moved with a quiet confidence, guiding the horse through the wideout with an instinct she could not comprehend. It was as if he could read the landscape in the dark, his senses attuned to a world that was utterly alien to her. Silas felt the light weight of her behind him, her small, cold hands holding on with a desperate strength. He was acutely aware of her presence, a foreign element in his solitary world. Her nearness was a disruption, a complication he had not wanted, yet here it was. He focused on the path, his mind mapping the familiar dips and rises of the terrain. He had walked this land 1,000 times in every season. He knew the way home as well as he knew the lines on his own hand. He had to get her to safety. That was the only thought he allowed himself. The rest, the why, the who, the what comes next, he pushed away, burying it under the immediate need for survival. After what felt like an eternity, a dark shape loomed out of the swirling snow. The cabin. It was larger than her own, built of thick, dark logs, with a stone chimney that was already breathing a steady column of smoke into the gale. It looked rooted to the earth, a part of the mountain itself, unmovable and strong. As they reached the relative shelter of the porch, Silas dismounted and then reached up to help her down. His hands were large and calloused as they circled her waist, lifting her from the saddle as if she weighed nothing. For a moment, she was suspended between the horse and the ground, held securely in his grasp. The contact was brief, impersonal, yet sent a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the promise of a fire. He led her inside, and the sudden quiet and warmth were a shock to her senses. The single room was spacious and meticulously ordered. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a cheerful fire already blazing within it. A sturdy table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. A bed was built into a corner, and shelves lined the walls, stacked neatly with supplies. Everything was simple, handmade, and built to last. It was the home of a man who depended on no one but himself. It was a fortress, just as he had intended. He gestured toward the fire. "Get warm. I'll see to the horse." Eleanor stumbled toward the hearth, her body numb and trembling. She held her hands out to the flames, the heat a painful, wonderful sensation on her frozen skin. She watched him move about the cabin, his actions economical and precise. He added a log to the fire, then went to a small cupboard and pulled out a tin mug and a jug of what she assumed was water. He placed them on the table. "There's coffee," he said, his back to her as he checked the latch on the door. "I'll make some when I get back." He disappeared back into the storm, and Eleanor was left alone in the quiet warmth of his home. She looked around, taking in the details. A rifle rested on pegs above the mantelpiece. A small collection of books sat on a shelf next to the bed. A worn leather-bound Bible was among them. This was a man of contradictions, a loner who read, a man of the wilderness who offered shelter to a stranger on Christmas Eve. She sank into one of the chairs at the table, the exhaustion of the past weeks, the fear of the last few hours, finally crashing down on her. She rested her head in her hands, a wave of profound relief washing over her. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. When Silas returned, stamping the snow from his boots, he found her asleep, her head pillowed on her arms at the table. For a long moment, he simply stood and watched her. The firelight softened the tired lines on her face, catching the auburn highlights in her disheveled hair. She looked fragile, out of place, like a songbird blown miles off course. A protective instinct, fierce and unfamiliar, stirred within him. It was a dangerous feeling, a vulnerability he had long ago sworn off. He quickly suppressed it, his face hardening back into its usual stoic mask. He moved quietly, not wanting to wake her. He hung his coat on a peg by the door and went to the stove to make coffee. The familiar ritual of grinding the beans and measuring the water was calming. It was a piece of his normal routine, a small anchor in this suddenly altered reality. The rich aroma soon filled the cabin, a comforting, domestic scent. He poured 2 mugs and set one on the table near her hand. The clink of the tin against the wood made her stir. Eleanor lifted her head, her eyes groggy with sleep. The smell of coffee was the first thing she registered. She looked at the steaming mug, then at him. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to fall asleep." "You were cold and tired," he said simply, taking the seat opposite her. "Drink. It'll warm you up." She wrapped her cold hands around the mug, the heat seeping into her fingers. She took a sip. It was strong and black, and it tasted like salvation. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the unabated howl of the wind outside. The silence wasn't awkward, it was watchful. She knew she owed him an explanation, but the words were hard to find. He broke the quiet first. "You're a long way from wherever you started." It wasn't a question, but an observation. "Philadelphia," she said, her voice quiet. "I came to claim an inheritance." "That cabin," she gave a small, humorless laugh. "It seems my father's memory of it was more generous than the reality." Silas nodded slowly. He knew the Miller place. It had been barely habitable 20 years ago. Not much of an inheritance. "No," she agreed. But it was a reason to leave. A destination. She looked down at her hands, at the raw, chapped skin. She had been a fool to think she could manage this on her own. Her independence felt like a child's fantasy now. Yet, she would not be a burden. "I can work," she said, her tone suddenly firm as she looked up to meet his gaze. "I can cook, I can clean, I can mend. I won't be in your debt, Mr. Blackwood." He was taken aback by the sudden fire in her eyes. He had expected tears, or perhaps a genteel sort of helplessness. He had not expected this proud declaration. A flicker of respect ignited within him. "The storm will keep us shut in for a few days at least. There'll be time enough to talk about work. For now, you need to eat and rest." He stood and moved to the pantry, pulling out smoked venison, a loaf of dark bread, and a wedge of cheese. He sliced them with a practiced hand and set the food on the table between them. It was a simple meal, but to Eleanor, it was a feast. They ate in a shared silence, the awkwardness of their first meeting slowly dissolving in the face of their forced proximity and a shared meal. The act of breaking bread together felt ancient and significant, a small truce in the war against the wilderness outside and the private wars within them. Over the next 2 days, the blizzard raged without pause, cocooning them in a world of white. The cabin became their entire universe. They fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Eleanor, true to her word, insisted on earning her keep. She took over the cooking, transforming his simple bachelor's fare into savory, nourishing meals. She found his mending basket and, with a needle and thread, repaired the tears in his shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She organized his chaotic pantry, her orderly mind finding satisfaction in creating neat rows of tins and jars. Silas watched her, a silent observer. He was impressed, more than he wanted to admit. She was not the fragile city woman he had first assumed. There was a quiet strength about her, a resilience that showed in the determined set of her jaw as she scrubbed his cast-iron skillet and in the steady focus of her hands as she sewed. She did not complain or lament her situation. She simply did what needed to be done. This recognition of her competence was a seed of respect that began to sprout in the barren ground of his solitude. He, in turn, found himself teaching her things. He showed her how to properly bank the fire at night so it would still be glowing in the morning. He explained the different types of wood and why pine burned hot and fast while oak burned slow and steady. He found her one afternoon looking at the books on his shelf, her fingers tracing the titles. "You read?" she asked, a note of surprise in her voice. "Some," he grunted, feeling strangely exposed. His books were a private part of him, a connection to a world he had otherwise abandoned. "Shakespeare, Emerson, the Bible," she murmured, reading the spines. "Not the usual library for a man of the mountains." "A man needs more than just bread and bacon to live on," he said, the words gruffer than he intended. She turned to him, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time. "No, he does not." The smile transformed her face, chasing away the shadows of fear and exhaustion. For a moment, Silas found it hard to look away. The attraction was a low, simmering heat beneath the surface of their practical cohabitation. It was in the way his eyes would linger on the curve of her neck as she bent over her mending, or the way her breath would catch when he stood too close, his large frame seeming to fill the entire cabin. They were constantly aware of each other, their movements a careful dance in the confined space. On the third night, the storm began to lose its fury. The wind's howl softened to a mournful sigh. They sat by the fire, the silence between them comfortable now, familiar. Eleanor was holding a small, silver locket in her hand, turning it over and over. Silas had noticed it before, the way she would touch it unconsciously, as if for reassurance. "My parents," she said softly, feeling his gaze on her. She opened the locket to reveal 2 miniature, faded portraits. "They died of influenza within a week of each other when I was 16. My stepfather inherited me along with my father's business." Silas remained quiet, his stillness an invitation for her to continue. He had learned in the war that sometimes the best comfort you could offer was simply to listen. "He sold the business piece by piece, and then he arranged my marriage to Judge Sterling." A shudder went through her at the name. "The judge is a powerful man, a collector of beautiful things. He wanted to add me to his collection." Her voice was low, laced with a bitterness that was sharp and cold. "My stepfather died 2 months ago. The wedding was set for January. I took what little money I had, and the deed to my father's old claim, and I ran." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I thought I was running toward freedom, Mr. Blackwood. I didn't realize I was just running toward a different kind of cage." The formal Mr. Blackwood sounded strange now, a relic from a time that felt impossibly distant. "Silas," he said, his voice a low rumble. "My name is Silas." He watched the fire for a long moment, the flames dancing in his gray eyes. The vulnerability she had shown him demanded something in return. It was a currency of trust he had not traded in for a very long time. "I had a brother," he began, the words feeling rusty and stiff in his throat. "Younger than me. His name was Thomas." He paused, the memory a physical ache in his chest. "We fought together at Shiloh. He died in my arms. After that, the world didn't make much sense anymore. All the noise, the people, it was too much. I came out here to find the quiet." He did not look at her as he spoke, his gaze fixed on the hypnotic dance of the flames. He was sharing the deepest wound of his soul, the bedrock of his isolation. He was handing her a piece of his brokenness, just as she had handed him hers. Eleanor listened, her heart aching for him, for the boy he had been and the man the war had made him. She saw it then, the shared thread of loss that connected them. They were 2 survivors, haunted by ghosts, who had sought refuge in the wilderness only to find each other. In that quiet moment by the fire, a profound bond was forged between them, deeper than gratitude, more potent than attraction. It was the bond of 2 kindred spirits recognizing each other in the dark. The internal conflict within Silas was a quiet storm that raged with the same intensity as the one outside. Having Eleanor in his home was like letting a wildflower grow in the middle of his fortress. She was vibrant and alive, and her presence was systematically dismantling the walls he had spent years building. He found himself watching her, memorizing the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating, the soft cadence of her voice when she read from one of his books in the evening. These feelings were a dangerous complication. They were a weakness. Love, he had learned in the cruelest way possible, was a prelude to loss. To care for someone was to give fate a target. And yet he could not stop the thawing in his chest, the slow, inexorable return of a warmth he had thought long dead. The morning of the 4th day, they awoke to a world transformed. The wind had died, and an eerie silence had fallen. Silas opened the door to a landscape of breathtaking beauty and immense danger. The snow was piled in massive drifts, sculpted by the wind into fantastical shapes. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the sun on the fresh snow was blinding. "The storm's broken," he announced. Eleanor came to stand beside him, her breath catching at the sight. It was beautiful, but it was also a stark reminder that the world existed beyond their small, warm cabin. The end of the storm meant the end of their enforced isolation. The thought brought with it a surprising pang of regret. Later that day, as Silas was digging a path to the woodshed, he saw it. A rider, a dark speck moving slowly against the vast white expanse, heading directly for his cabin. His body went rigid. Visitors were rare to the point of being non-existent. A rider, so soon after a major blizzard, could only mean one thing: trouble. "Get inside," he said to Eleanor, who was shaking a blanket out on the porch. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but she heard the underlying urgency. "And stay there. Don't make a sound." She saw the look on his face and didn't argue. She disappeared into the cabin, her heart beginning to pound. Silas watched the rider approach, his hand resting casually on the handle of the Colt Peacemaker, holstered at his hip. The man was well-dressed for the frontier, with a new coat and a confident air. He rode a fine horse, one that looked out of place in this rugged country. As he drew nearer, Silas saw the cold, assessing look in his eyes. This was not a lost traveler. This was a hunter. The man reined in his horse a few yards from a porch. "You Blackwood?" he asked, his tone arrogant. "I am," Silas replied, his voice level. "Name's Thorn." "Jedediah Thorn," the man said, as if the name should mean something. "I'm looking for a woman, an heiress from back east. Name of Eleanor Vance. She lit out of Philadelphia a few weeks back. Word is she was headed for this part of the territory." He gestured vaguely toward the mountains. "There's a substantial reward for information leading to her whereabouts." He let that hang in the air. A clear bribe. Inside, Eleanor pressed her ear to the door, her blood running cold. Thorn. She had heard Judge Sterling mention the name. A man he used for difficult tasks. A Pinkerton agent of dubious morals. They had found her. The fragile sense of safety she had felt shattered into a million pieces. Silas's face remained an unreadable mask. He thought of Eleanor inside, of the fear he had seen in her eyes when she spoke of Judge Sterling. He thought of her quiet strength, her unexpected smile. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an inevitability. The fortress had been breached, and now he had to defend it. "Can't help you," Silas said, his voice as cold as the snow around them. "Haven't seen any women, heiress or otherwise. Just me and the storm for the past week." It was a lie, a direct and unequivocal falsehood, and as the words left his mouth, he felt a profound shift within himself. He was no longer just a man offering temporary shelter. He was her protector. He had drawn a line in the snow, and this man, Thorn, was on the other side of it. Thorn's eyes narrowed, scanning the cabin, the single track of footprints Silas had made to the woodshed, the smoke rising from the chimney. "You live out here all alone?" A man gets lonely. A pretty young woman shows up, lost. It'd be tempting to keep her to yourself. The insinuation was ugly, insulting. Silas's hand tightened on the grip of his pistol. "I like it alone," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "And I don't take kindly to men casting aspersions on my character on my own land. Now, you've asked your question, and I've given my answer. I suggest you move on." The two men stared at each other. A silent battle of wills waged across the snow-covered yard. Thorn was a man used to getting his way through intimidation and money. But he saw something in Silas's cold gray eyes that gave him pause. It was not fear. It was a complete lack of it. It was the look of a man who had faced down death. Thorn gave a curt, humorless smile. "All right, Blackwood. I'll take you at your word. For now." He wheeled his horse around. "But my employer is a very determined man. He'll find her, and whoever is helping her will regret it." With that final threat, he spurred his horse and rode away, his dark figure shrinking against the white landscape. Silas watched until he was gone, his body rigid with tension. He knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning. He turned and went back inside the cabin, his mind already racing. Eleanor was standing in the middle of the room, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I heard," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Silas. I have brought this danger to your door." "It's not your fault," he said, his voice rough. He bolted the door and went to the fireplace, staring into the flames. The quiet life he had built was over. Thorn's words echoed in his mind. "My employer is a very determined man. Judge Sterling would not give up. He had the law, the money, and the influence to tear this territory apart looking for her. They could not hide forever." They were trapped. If she left, Sterling's men would find her. If she stayed, they would eventually find her here, and Silas would be caught in the crossfire. He saw the path ahead, narrow and dangerous, but it was the only one he could see that offered any chance of protecting her. The thought formed in his mind, stark and practical and utterly insane. He turned from the fire to face her, his expression grim. "This Judge Sterling," he began, his voice low and serious. "He wants you. He believes you belong to him." "He does," she confirmed, her voice trembling slightly. In his mind, "I am his property." "He can't claim another man's property," Silas stated, the words blunt and devoid of any romance. "He can't legally force a married woman to leave her husband." Eleanor stared at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you saying?" Silas took a breath, the fortress of his solitude crumbling to dust around him. He was about to chain himself to the very thing he had spent years avoiding, a connection, a responsibility, a future intertwined with another's. It was a desperate gamble, a crucible that would either forge a new life for them or burn them both to ash. "I'm saying you should marry me," he said. The words hung in the air between them, as stark and shocking as the silence after a rifle shot. Eleanor stared at Silas, certain she had misheard. Marry him? The man she had met only 4 days ago? A man who cherished his solitude above all else? It would give us time to figure out what to do next. He saw the shock and confusion in her eyes and felt a pang of something he couldn't name. He was offering her a shield, but it was a cold, hard shield of logic. He did not speak of the truth that was burning in his chest, that the thought of her facing Thorne and Sterling alone was unbearable, that the idea of her leaving his cabin, of her light being extinguished from his life, was a prospect more terrifying than any battlefield he had ever faced. But those were words he did not know how to say, so he stuck to the practical. Eleanor's mind reeled. A marriage of convenience. It was a trope from the penny dreadfuls she used to read, a dramatic device that had no place in reality. And yet, here it was, presented as a logical answer to an impossible problem. She looked at Silas, at his earnest, grim face, and saw that he was completely serious. She thought of Judge Sterling's cold, possessive gaze and Jedediah Thorne's cruel sneer. They would not stop. They would hunt her down, and when they found her, her fate would be sealed. This stranger, this honorable loner, was offering her the only weapon she might have against them. But she had just escaped one cage. Was she about to willingly walk into another, even one gilded with the promise of safety? She had dreamed of independence, of a life of her own making. A marriage, even a practical one, felt like a surrender of that dream. "And what of you, Silas?" she asked, her voice regaining some of its strength. "What do you get from this arrangement? You value your quiet, your solitude. A wife is not a quiet thing to have." "All right," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I will marry you, but on one condition." Silas raised an eyebrow, waiting. "If we do this," she continued, looking him directly in the eye, "it must be a real marriage. Not in every sense, perhaps, not at first. But in here," she gestured to the cabin, to the space between them, "there will be no pretense. We will be partners. We will face this together as equals. I will not be a piece of property you are protecting, but a wife who stands beside you." Her condition hung in the air, a challenge and a promise. She was forcing him to confront the reality of what he was proposing. This would not be a simple legal maneuver. It would be a fundamental change to both their lives, a weaving together of two solitary threads. Silas looked at her, at the defiant tilt of her chin and the unwavering honesty in her eyes. He had offered her a shield, and she had offered him a partnership. It was more than he had dared to hope for. A slow nod was his only reply, but it was a solemn vow. The next morning, they rode out. The journey to the town of Hope's Creek was slow, the snow still deep in the valleys. They rode in a world of blinding white and brilliant blue, the silence of the wilderness a stark contrast to the tumult in their minds. They were about to bind their lives together, two strangers united by a common threat. Hope's Creek was little more than a main street carved out of the wilderness, a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled together as if for warmth. They found the circuit judge, a weary-looking man named Elias Thorne, no relation to the Pinkerton, a fact Silas grimly confirmed, holding court in the back of the general store. The storekeeper, a stout, kind-faced woman named Martha, watched them with shrewd, perceptive eyes as Silas explained their purpose. "Want to get hitched, are you?" Judge Thorne asked, peering at them over his spectacles. "Bit of a hurry, ain't it?" "The Lord's work waits for no man, Judge," Silas said cryptically, "and neither does spring planting." Martha, the storekeeper, seemed to understand more than Silas said. She looked at Eleanor's fine, though worn, dress, and the protective way Silas stood beside her. She had seen enough of the world to recognize desperation and decency when they walked through her door. "Let them be, Elias," she said gently. "The world is hard enough. Let folks find their happiness where they can." She offered to stand as their witness. The ceremony was held right there between barrels of flour and sacks of beans. It was brief and unadorned. Judge Thorne read the word from his worn book, his voice droning on in the quiet store. Eleanor and Silas stood side by side, not touching, their eyes fixed on the judge. When the time came, they spoke their vows, their voices low but clear in the small space. I do, 2 simple words that changed everything. Well then, the judge declared, closing his book, "By the authority vested in me by the Montana Territory, I pronounce you man and wife. You may, kiss the bride." The final words were an awkward afterthought. Silas turned to Eleanor. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them standing in the dusty light of the general store. This was the moment their practical arrangement became something real, something witnessed and sealed. He looked into her eyes, seeing a mixture of fear, hope, and a startling amount of trust. Slowly, hesitantly, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was chaste, a brief, gentle pressure. It was not a kiss of passion, but of promise. It was the sealing of a pact, a solemn acknowledgement of the new reality of their lives. Yet for both of them, it was electric. It was the first deliberate touch that was not born of necessity or accident. It was a spark that lit a fuse, leading to a future neither of them could yet imagine. Wade pulled back. The air between them was charged, thick with unspoken emotions. They were husband and wife. And now, they had to face what came next. The ride back to the cabin was different. The landscape was the same, but they were not. Eleanor occasionally glanced at the man riding beside her. Her husband. The word felt foreign, unreal. She wore a simple gold band on her finger, purchased from Martha's small selection of goods. It felt heavy, a tangible symbol of the irreversible step they had taken. Silas was even quieter than usual, his profile rigid as he stared ahead. She wondered what he was thinking, if he regretted his impulsive, practical proposal. Silas was, in fact, in turmoil. The brief touch of her lips had sent a shock wave through him. It had felt more real, more binding, than any legal document. He had done this to protect her, he told himself. But the truth, a truth he was terrified to admit, was that he had also done it to keep her. He had tied her to him because the thought of her riding out of his life was a pain he was unwilling to endure. He had traded his solitude for her safety, and he was beginning to realize it was a trade he had made for himself as much as for her. The weight of her yes and the reality of the ring on her finger settled in his soul. He was responsible for her now, in the eyes of the law and in the depths of his own honor-bound heart. They arrived back at the cabin as twilight painted the snow-covered peaks in hues of purple and rose. The home that had been his was now theirs. The thought was both daunting and strangely comforting. As Eleanor dismounted, she looked at the sturdy log structure, the wisp of smoke still rising from the chimney from their morning fire. It was no longer just a refuge. It was her home. That night, the tension in the small space was palpable. The single bed in the corner, which he had offered her since her arrival, while he slept in a bedroll by the fire, now loomed large in their awareness. It was their wedding night. A wedding night born of danger and necessity, but a wedding night nonetheless. After a silent supper, Eleanor took a deep breath. "Silas," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "We made an agreement to be partners. That bed is large enough for two people who wish to keep their distance." It was a bold statement, a direct confrontation of the awkwardness that lay between them. She would not let them be driven apart by unspoken fears on their very first night as husband and wife. Silas looked at her, surprised once again by her directness. She was right. Hiding in his bedroll would be a retreat, a denial of the partnership she had insisted upon. It would be a lie. "All right," he agreed, his voice rough. Later, after the fire was banked and the lamp extinguished, they lay in the bed, separated by a carefully maintained river of blankets. They lay on their backs, staring up into the darkness, the space between them charged with a powerful current of unspoken feelings. It was an intimacy more profound than any physical touch, a shared vulnerability in the dark. "Silas," she whispered into the quiet. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." He did not answer, but in the darkness his hand moved across the blankets until his fingers brushed against hers. He hesitated for only a second before his hand closed around hers, his thumb stroking gently over her knuckles. It was a simple, tender gesture, an anchor in the uncertain night. It was an answer, a promise, and a confession all at once. And holding his hand, Eleanor Vance Blackwood finally, truly, felt she had come home. The peace, however fragile, was not to last. A week later, as Silas was chopping wood, he heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. His hand froze mid-swing. It was not the slow, plodding pace of a neighbor. It was the determined, rhythmic beat of riders with a purpose. He dropped the axe and moved quickly to the cabin, his face a grim mask. "They're here," he said as he entered. Eleanor, who had been kneading dough, looked up, her hands covered in flour. The color drained from her face. "Get the rifle," he commanded, his voice calm and low. "Stay away from the window." He went to the door, checking the load in his Colt as he peered through a small peephole he had drilled in the wood. There were 3 of them. Jedediah Thorne was in the lead. Beside him rode a portly, well-dressed man with a florid face and an air of supreme arrogance that could only belong to Judge Alastair Sterling. The third man was a rough-looking gunslinger, his eyes cold and empty. "Silas Blackwood." Sterling's voice boomed across the clearing, dripping with condescension. "I have come for my property. Send out Miss Vance at once, and we can forget this unfortunate interference." Silas felt a cold rage settle over him. He opened the door just enough to be seen, his body shielding the interior of the cabin from view. "There's no Miss Vance here," he called back, his voice ringing with authority. "Only my wife, Eleanor Blackwood." Sterling's face contorted with fury. "Wife? Do you take me for a fool? That is a lie, a pathetic attempt to hide her." "We were married in Hope's Creek a week ago," Silas stated flatly. "The marriage is registered with Judge Thorne. She is my wife, and she is on my land. You are trespassing, Sterling. I suggest you leave." Sterling dismounted, his face purple with rage. "You backwoods peasant. You think a sham marriage will stop me? She is promised to me. I will have her." He started toward the cabin, his hired gun moving with him, his hand hovering over his pistol. "That's far enough," Silas warned, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. He raised the Colt, the hammer clicking back with an ominous finality. The showdown had come. In that instant, Silas knew he would die on this spot before he let them take her. The years of isolation, of running from the ghosts of the past, had led him here, to this moment of absolute clarity. His purpose was no longer to find peace in solitude, but to defend the life and the love he had found within these 4 walls. The standoff was a taut wire of suspense. Sterling, Thorne, and the hired gun stood 20 yards from the porch, facing the lone figure of Silas Blackwood. The judge's face was a mask of apoplectic fury. "You cannot win, Blackwood," Sterling snarled. "I'm the law in all but name. I will have you rotting in a cell for this." "There's a different kind of law out here, Judge," Silas retorted, his voice dangerously quiet. "The kind that says a man protects his own. Inside the cabin, Eleanor's fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overlaid with a white-hot anger. She would not be a passive victim. She would not cower while Silas risked his life for her. She moved to the wall where the second rifle hung, the one Silas had taught her to use. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was like steel. This was her fight, too. This was the partnership she had demanded. Sterling, realizing threats were useless, made a sharp gesture to his men. "Thorn, you and Cutter take him. I will retrieve what is mine." The world exploded into motion. The hired gun, Cutter, drew his pistol with lightning speed. But Silas was ready. His Colt bucked in his hand, the shot echoing like a thunderclap in the high mountain valley. Cutter grunted, stumbling back, his own shot going wild and splintering the wood of the porch railing. At the same moment, Thorn drew and fired, his bullet tearing through the sleeve of Silas's coat, a hot sting along his arm. Silas dove for cover behind a stack of firewood as another bullet whizzed past his head. He was pinned, one man against two trained gunmen. He fired back, forcing Thorn to duck behind his horse. But he knew it was a losing battle. They had him outflanked. It was then that the cabin's second window shattered. Eleanor, her face set with grim determination, leveled the heavy rifle barrel across the sill. She took a steadying breath, remembering Silas's patient instruction. "Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." She sighted on Thorn, who was taking aim at Silas's position. She squeezed. The rifle kicked back hard against her shoulder, but her shot was true. It didn't hit Thorn, but struck the ground at his feet, spraying snow and dirt into his face. He yelled in surprise and anger, momentarily blinded, giving Silas the opening he needed. Silas vaulted over the woodpile, his gun steady. "Drop it, Thorn," he commanded. From the other side, Cutter, clutching a wounded shoulder, tried to raise his pistol again. But before he could fire, another shot rang out, this one from the trees at the edge of the clearing. Cutter's gun flew from his hand, and he cried out in pain. Everyone froze, turning toward the source of the shot. Two riders emerged from the pines. The grizzled sheriff of Hope's Creek, his smoking pistol held aloft, and the storekeeper, Martha, sitting astride a mule with a shotgun laid across her lap. "That's enough of that, Sterling," the sheriff called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of the law. Martha here was worried you might not take no for an answer. Seemed she was right. Sterling's face went from purple to a pasty white. He was caught. His power, his influence, meant nothing in the face of a smoking gun and a determined sheriff. The law he so often bent to his will was now standing squarely against him. "Sheriff, this man has abducted my fiancée." Sterling blustered, his last desperate attempt at control. "That's not what the marriage certificate I saw says," the sheriff countered dryly. "What it looks like to me is attempted murder, trespassing, and threatening a citizen of this territory. Now, you and your men are going to drop your weapons." Slowly, Thorn and the wounded Cutter, seeing the situation was hopeless, let their guns fall to the snow. The threat was over. The violent confrontation had ended not just with their survival, but with a decisive victory. The antagonist, so powerful and menacing, was neutralized, his authority revealed as a hollow sham in this new land. Silas slowly lowered his pistol, his eyes finding Eleanor's in the shattered window. He saw not a frightened heiress, but a warrior, a partner who had stood and fought beside him. The love that had been growing in the quiet corners of his heart burst forth, fierce and undeniable. She had not just been a person to protect. She had been his salvation. In the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, the clearing felt unnaturally still. The sheriff took Sterling and his men into custody, their departure leaving behind only the churned snow and the lingering scent of gunpowder. Martha stayed for a moment, her warm eyes settling on Eleanor. "You chose a good man, child," she said softly, before turning her mule to follow the sheriff back to town. Silas and Eleanor were finally alone. He walked into the cabin, his eyes immediately finding hers. The rifle was still propped on the windowsill, a testament to her courage. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, stopping just before her. He gently took the rifle from her hands and set it aside. Then He cupped her face, his callous thumbs stroking her cheeks. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. She nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the soot on her cheek. "You were hurt," she whispered, her gaze falling to the torn sleeve of his coat. "It's just a scratch," he dismissed, his attention focused entirely on her. "Eleanor?" He struggled for the words, the stoic walls he had maintained for so long finally crumbling to dust. "When I saw them coming, all I could think about was losing you. The marriage, it started as a practical thing, a way to protect you. But it was a lie, Eleanor. Not the marriage, but the reason. I did it to keep you. Because a life without you in it, it's not a life I want to live anymore. It's just an empty room." His confession, so raw and heartfelt, undid her. The tears she had been holding back began to fall freely. "Oh, Silas," she breathed, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, over his rapidly beating heart. "I was so afraid. Not just of them, but of losing this. Of losing you. I fled Philadelphia to be free, but I never knew what freedom was until I found myself snowbound in this cabin with a stubborn, silent man who reads Shakespeare." A watery smile touched her lips. "I love you, Silas Blackwood. I love you, Eleanor," he said, the words feeling more right, more true than anything he had ever said. He lowered his head and kissed her, and this time there was no hesitation, no chaste promise. It was a kiss of searing passion and profound relief, a declaration of a love forged in a blizzard, tested by fire, and now, finally, free to burn brightly. They clung to each other, two solitary souls who had found their other half in the most unlikely of places. They stood there for a long time, simply holding each other, the shared dream of a future together taking root in the quiet of the cabin. "We'll expand the house," he murmured into her hair. "Add a room for a school, if you still want one. Plant an apple orchard in the spring." "We'll get more books," she replied, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "And a cow, and maybe a dog." They were no longer just making plans for survival. They were building a life, brick by brick, word by word. The practical arrangement had become a foundation of love, their hasty wedding the cornerstone of a shared destiny. 7 years later, the cabin was the heart of a thriving ranch. 2 new wings had been added, built from the same sturdy timber as the original structure, the logs felled and hewn by Silas's own hands. One wing was a spacious schoolroom, where Eleanor taught reading, writing, and arithmetic to a dozen children from the surrounding homesteads. The other was a warm, noisy nursery. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Eleanor stood on the expanded porch, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the now mature apple trees. She watched as Silas taught their 6-year-old son, Thomas, how to properly hold a hammer. Thomas, with his father's serious gray eyes and his mother's auburn hair, was concentrating with all his might, his small tongue sticking out from the corner of his mouth. A smaller, warmer weight settled in her arms as she shifted their infant daughter, Sarah, against her shoulder. The ranch was prosperous, their herd of cattle renowned throughout the valley. Their home was filled with love, laughter, and the happy chaos of a growing family. The ghosts of Philadelphia and Shiloh had not vanished entirely, but they had faded, their mournful whispers drowned out by the vibrant sounds of the life they had built. Silas looked up from his work and saw her watching them. His face, weathered by the sun and wind, broke into a slow, familiar smile that was reserved only for her. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked over to the porch, his long strides eating up the distance. He leaned against the railing beside her, his arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her and the baby close. "He's got a good eye," Silas said, nodding toward their son, who was now proudly tapping a nail into a scrap of wood. "But not much patience. He gets that from his mother," Eleanor teased, leaning her head against his shoulder. She looked out over their land, the rolling pastures, the sturdy fences, the mountains standing sentinel against the horizon. It was a harsh, demanding land, but it had given them everything. "Do you ever miss it?" Silas asked quietly, his gaze following hers. "The city? The life you left behind?" Eleanor thought for a moment of the stifling drawing rooms, the cold society, the man who had seen her as a possession. She thought of the fear and desperation that had driven her into the wilderness. Then she looked at the honorable man beside her, felt the warmth of their daughter in her arms, and heard the sound of their son's happy hammering. "No," she said, her voice filled with a deep and abiding certainty. "I was never home until I came here." He turned her to face him, his gray eyes soft with a love that had only deepened with the passing years. "It was a cold night, that Christmas Eve," he murmured, his hand coming up to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "The cabin was empty. Then you knocked." She smiled, remembering his version of the story, the one he told their children. "I believe it was you who did the knocking, my love," she corrected gently. "Either way," he said, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was as familiar and comforting as the mountain air they breathed. "You came in, and the emptiness was gone." They stood together on the porch of the home they had built, a testament to the truth they had discovered in the heart of a winter storm. That true strength, true survival, was never found in isolation, but in the brave and beautiful act of letting someone in.